When we think about the Mesozoic era, what often comes to mind is the variety of reptiles that once dominated the lands, seas, and skies of the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. But these animals were far from alone, and often overlooked are the myriad of other creatures that were doing just as weird things and setting their own evolutionary records. In case you didn't already know, the earliest period in this time frame, the Triassic, had a lot of really weird things going on. So many that this channel is going to be dedicated to exploring as many of them as possible in this series, Triassic... What the f***? Now, you might be thinking, haven't I seen this before? Yeah, you might have. But that was the old me from 2 years ago when I started this channel, and I figured for the second anniversary I'd go back and redo this entry with my much improved videography skills and equipment, as well as update the actual content with some new research that's come out since its initial release, instead of just adding it to the customary updates and corrections thread that I have on every long-form video. I'm actually not sure if I'll unlist the original version, but I'll link it here anyway so that you can always go back to rewatch it for nostalgia's sake if you've been here since the beginning. With all of that out of the way, let's re-meet Gigatitan, a 3-species genus of big insects that lived during the mid to late Triassic period. How big, you ask? That big. Maybe. Gigatitan was a member of the aptly and coolly named Titanoptera. These guys are an early diverging branch of the order Orthoptera, a group whose most familiar modern representatives include crickets and grasshoppers, and their reproductive anatomy, which will be discussed later, suggests that they're most closely related to, if not within, the suborder Ensiphera. These are your true crickets, dune crickets, katydids, camel crickets, grigs, weddas, and Kalula monsters, among others. Until recently, Titanopterans were commonly thought to have first evolved in the Permian, although newer research, including new fossil discoveries, indicates that their origins go back as far as the Carboniferous, which the more paleogeekier among you may recognize as the time of giant arthropods, like scorpions, dragonflies, and millipedes. But not this.
The arthropods are back.
Speaking of outdated paleo memes, wait, you might say, I thought all the giant bugs died out at the end of the Carboniferous because of the drop in oxygen levels. Well, while at least terrestrial arthropods since then haven't generally gotten quite as large as they did in the Carboniferous, there's still evidence that suggests that the widespread extinction of the biggest terrestrial species had less to do with oxygen levels. In fact, the Triassic actually had lower oxygen levels than today, which had been sharply declining during the Permian, while Titanopterans seem to have only grown in size over the course of their evolutionary history as they spread across Pangaea to achieve a range spanning from what is now Central Asia to Australia, so that should speak to the fact that oxygen availability isn't the end-all be-all factor for having big bugs. Although Titanoptera as a whole was first named in 1885, the bulk of research into these insects' anatomy and ecology comes from work started in the late 1960s by Soviet scientists like Alexander Grigorovich Sharov, who named and described Gigatitan itself in 1968. These descriptions were based on fossil remains found in the Triassic-aged Madigan Formation, which is located in the northern region of the Turkestan Mountains in southwestern Kyrgyzstan, and dates back to the Ladinian and/or Carnian ages, some 242 to 227 million years ago, though the exact age of the site hasn't been determined yet. During this time, the area was a temperate, humid environment along the southern shore of a large inland submontane lake that gradually fluctuated in size due to the surrounding tectonic activity. The ebb and flow changes in the shoreline resulted in regions along the coast of the lake being a mix of swampy and forested floodplains and deltas, crisscrossed with rivers and streams that drained into the lake from further upland. Although there are remains from a variety of fish, amphibians, reptiles, and synapsids, this site is dominated by insects, with some 15,000 or so fossils known from this formation. Among the largest of these is, of course, Gigatitan. As aforementioned and implied by its name, these guys were definitely big, at least by bug standards, but exactly how big is a bit up in the air and complicated by two main factors. Firstly, few if any complete fossils have been found, never mind photographed, of Gigatitan and other Titanopterans, and given current events, it certainly doesn't help that most of the fossils are in Russian museums, so it's hard to pin down their actual body shape and proportions from species to species. This of course means that good linear dimensions are hard to ascertain. What we do have of their wings indicates wingspans of anywhere from 24 to 40 centimeters, with one fossil from Madigan suggesting an individual with an over 50 centimeter wingspan. However, the second issue comes from recent researchers like Dr. Olivier Bethaud of the French National Museum of Natural History, who advises caution for this wing in particular.
And the specimen there, there's something important. They have been deformed, tectonically deformed, and to a large extent. Like you imagine a wing, it's fossilized in the rock, but then the rock, because of tectonic movements or whatever, is still plastic to some extent, and then will be elongated.
Right.
So in this locality, you have huge wings, but because they were along the elongation axis of the rock, so then they're bigger than what they were. I tried to do retrodeformation on these wings. I mean, not specifically Titanoptera, but from this locality. And what I derived is that the elongation factor varies. So it's very difficult actually to reconstruct them. But it can go up to 1.5 elongation factor.
Oh.
So it's very serious. That means that the longest wing possibly is elongated 1.5 times. So that makes a very huge range of possibilities.
This would mean that this potentially huge individual could in truth only be as small as 37 centimeters across. Of course, this would still be a bug with a wingspan of over a foot long, so it's not a terrible potential downsize. Despite their iffiness on reliable size info, these wings can still tell us a lot about the biology and evolutionary history of Gigatitan and other Titanopterans. Current understanding of exactly how these insects are related to each other and other orthopterans has been informed by wing venation patterns, which is the shape and arrangement of veins running through the wings. It was this research by Bethaud that led to the current thinking of Titanoptera being a group within Orthoptera as opposed to just being a stem group. In the original version of this video, I mentioned that these fossils might have shown that Titanopterans like Gigatitan were capable of stridulation, which is the act of making sounds by rubbing two body parts together. In this system, one spiky body part called the file, or scraper, rubs against another part called the speculum, which usually has a third structure connected to it that amplifies and disperses the sounds, sometimes collectively termed the speaker. Scrapers and speakers can be any combination of limbs, wings, or even mouth parts, with a variety of structures evolving independently across different arthropod groups, even within Ensiphera. In Gigatitan and other Titanopterans, the large rectangular window-like structures on their forewings bear a superficial similarity to the speakers seen in katydids and true crickets, and for decades this was suggested to imply that, like their living relatives, these insects were producing territorial or mating calls by rubbing their wings together. However, a study published in July 2021 has casted some doubt on Titanopteran wings having this kind of sound-producing function. Sparked by the discovery of a new species from Carboniferous rocks, the scientists involved looked at the structure of Titanopteran wings and compared them to a variety of other insects, including but not limited to their living Ensiferan relatives. The study found that there is much more structural, and thus likely functional, variation among Titanopteran wings than has previously been appreciated, identifying 4 main uses that are seen among modern insects with similar anatomies. The first of these, stridulation, was ruled out for most Titanopterans, including Gigatitan, due to the biomechanics of their wings, which were essentially not arranged in a way that would allow the specialized cells to be rubbed against another body part to produce sound. On top of this, there's a lack of fossil evidence for any sort of scraper element in general, so this has always been a rather weakly supported hypothesis that managed to persist in part because most decent Titanopteran fossils have been relatively inaccessible due to the Cold War, and the work of the aforementioned Sharov had to be taken at face value much of the time, if you could find it in the first place. There are other methods of wing-based sound making though, which the 2021 study also looked at. Castanet signaling is one of those alternatives, and works by basically slapping the resonating parts of the wings together. Unlike modern orthopterans that use this method, Titanopteran hindwings lack the specially adapted wing cells, so they'd have to rely entirely on forewing action, which isn't impossible. Some moths actually do this. However, the articulation of the wings once again poses an issue, since the forewings of Gigatitan would pretty much fold sideways, and the likely range of motion was fairly limited in the up and down direction, so castanetting looks like another improbable option. The other sound-making alternative is called crepitation, and holds more promise. Crepitation works by air flowing over a surface, causing it to quickly expand and vibrate. Many grasshopper groups use this method to produce sound as they fly, and this would work much better for the wing structure seen in Gigatitan, which, unlike other decently known genera like its Australian cousin Claptratitan, has structurally simpler cells that would have held a relatively weak membrane between the veins. There is one slight problem though. The study notes that crepitation is closely correlated with flight, since that's when the air would of course be moving the fastest over the animal's wings. So the question becomes, Could Gigatitan actually fly? Surely those giant wings had to be useful for that. Well, because of their large size and our lack of clarity regarding their true body shapes and proportions, exactly how flight-capable Gigatitan and other Titanopterans were is unclear. It's usually hypothesized that, like many of their modern large-winged relatives, like lubber grasshoppers, flight is something that they were capable of, but not especially good at. To address their question of sound production via crepitation, the authors of the new study looked at a relatively complete fossil of the largest species, G. vulgaris, to see how its wing and body size proportions compared to its large living relatives. The results don't look great. Even this small individual with a roughly 8-inch wingspan has an estimated body mass that puts it as far too heavy for its size to be able to achieve powered flight, though there is still potential for gliding. In such a swampy forested environment with waterlogged ground cover, Gigatitan probably had to be competently volant enough to move from tree to tree, especially since its known hind limb morphology suggests that it wasn't much of a jumper. Given this, crepitation seems like it would have been limited to a more stationary version. Perhaps Gigatitan simply flapped its wings to produce sound without actually going anywhere. There isn't really a modern equivalent to that in insects, but it's the model that fits the data available. If they were making sounds, the size of Titanopterans would probably result in notably lower pitched noises than their smaller relatives, and these sounds would have been picked up by either specialized hairs on their bodies called setae, or tympanic organs which in modern relatives are located on their front legs, a notion you may find both cool and slightly creepy. The astute viewers might notice that I only mentioned 3 potential functions of the wings evaluated by this study. Of course, that's because we like to save the best for last around these parts. The 4th potential function of Titanopteran wings is what the authors termed flash display, and it probably looked about as cool as it sounds. The specialized cells on the wings of many Titanopterans, including Gigatitan, are concentrated on specific regions of the wing, and in many species cover a relatively high percentage of its surface area. Like in modern light-based flash-displaying insects, these cells are roughly paired and rotated at a slight incline relative to each other in a way that light would have reflected off of one of an individual pair and bounced onto the other, which itself would reflect that light in a different angle. The difference in the cell's orientations relative to the rest of the wing would create high-contrast flashes of light that could be seen up to several meters away, and the specific direction and pattern of flashing could be controlled by the angle and speed at which the insects move their wings. Depending on their microscopic structure, it might even be possible for specific color displays to have evolved among different species of light-flashing Titanopterans. With their large eyes, it's certainly possible that these insects could have seen a variety of colors, so a visual display like this, complemented by the whistle-like sounds of air moving over their wing membranes, isn't too far-fetched. Unlike many of its famously chirping relatives, Gigatitan territorial and courtship displays may very well have been quite the sight to see on a walk among the ancient Madigan forests. Further possible evidence of an arboreal lifestyle comes from their reproductive anatomy. Like modern ensiferans, whose name derives from the Latin term ensifer, meaning sword-bearer, female Titanopterans had long blade-like ovipositors on the end of their abdomens. These egg-laying structures were armed with sharp ridges used to cut into plant material like leaf stems and bark in order to safely deposit their eggs. This behavior is called endophytic oviposition, and traces of this activity have been documented in plant fossils from rocks dating as far back as the Carboniferous, although none of these cases have specifically been attributed to any particular insect taxa. Little is known about the growth of Titanopterans, though like all arthropods, they would have gone through at least a few different rounds of molting their exoskeletons before reaching adulthood. Large arthropods tend to grow more slowly than smaller-bodied species, so it's not unlikely that it could have taken Gigatitan notably longer than modern relatives to reach their full size. What we do know is that these little babies would have grown up to become some not-so-friendly bugs. Unlike most of their modern relatives, Titanopterans were seemingly obligate carnivores, with fossils of Gigatitan itself preserving a head armed with robust and sharp incisiform mandibles that would have been well suited to cutting into prey. On top of that, their long forelimbs were decked out with a row of sharp spikes. These features, in combination with large eyes and long, sensitive antennae, suggest that Gigatitan was not just carnivorous, but an active predator, lurking among tree branches and using its arms to grasp unfortunate prey and bring it back towards its mouthparts. If this looks and sounds familiar to you, welcome to the concept of convergent evolution, where 2 or more relatively unrelated groups of organisms evolve similar adaptations to fit into the same ecological niche. We've seen this in the barracuda-like coelacanth Rebellatrix and its parrotfish-esque cousin Phorea, and we'll continue to see it throughout this series. These adaptations would have made Gigatitan one of the baddest bugs on the block, hunting the variety of other insects and arthropods it shared its environment with. Plus, if modern mantid and other predatory arthropod behavior is at all applicable here, it wouldn't be out of the question for the largest of Titanopterans to have preyed on some relatively large animals themselves, which in the Madigan Formation would put a menagerie of eclectic, small lizard-like reptiles on Gigatitan's menu, as well as some other potentially surprising quarry in other parts of Titanopteran's range. On top of this, their presumably arboreal lifestyle and the seeming lack of comparably large carnivorous terrestrial vertebrates in their environments suggests that at least adult Gigatitan would have had little to fear, making these insects apex predators. It's not clear why Gigatitan and other contemporary relatives in places like Australia went extinct by the end of the Triassic, especially after having survived the Great Dying, the biggest mass extinction event in Earth's history that wiped out an estimated 90% of animal life at the end of the Permian. Like their giant arthropod brethren of the Carboniferous, it likely had to do with a combination of environmental changes that they couldn't adapt fast enough to, and ecological competition from those pesky bone-having reptiles and synapsids that were taking over the land, and in the Triassic, the sky as well. Given the much more limited flight capabilities of these giant insects compared to the newly emerged pterosaurs, it's quite possible that Gigatitan and co. might have gradually found themselves outcompeted for prey in the long run, with their young possibly ending up on the menu as well. Whatever the reason, the extinction of the Titanopterans marked the true end of the reign of the giant bugs, leaving us with mere clues of a strange world of foot-long cricket mantis chimeras, their brilliant light shows permanently dimmed, their deep whistles forever silenced. Comes from work started in the late 1960s by Russian scientists who named and described Gigatitan. Although Titanoptera as a whole was first named in 1885, the bulk of research